does not taste good. It's unfortunate. But I have no idea how long this video is gonna be. Hey guys, my name is Cassidy and you're watching That Spooky Lifestyle, where we bring the ooky, the spooky, the creepy and the crawly into our everyday lives. Today we are going to be talking about vampires, kind of like everything to do with them, kind of some origins, all the way up to like modern vampires now, different ways to kill them, different types of vampires. We got a lot to talk about today. I've been setting up polls on my Instagram of like what topics you guys want to do next, and oh my god, so many people voted for vampires, and it's so funny because I just thought that they were like so kind of overdone, and I'm like, oh, no one's gonna be interested in that. But turns out everyone was interested in that. So today we're gonna be talking about vampires while we do our makeup, just for something to do while we chat. So if that's something that interests you, then keep on watching. Today I'm not going to be talking a lot about Dracula, like the actual Dracula character. I'm gonna touch on it like a little bit slightly. This video is really all about like vampire creatures. It's not going to be just about the fictional character Dracula. Just wanted to clear that up in case anyone is out here being confused. If you've seen any of my other Get Ready With Me videos, you know that I always like to start by talking about what I already know about the subject before I started researching it. I had a pretty just like general overview knowledge of what a vampire was. I'm into the ooky spooky-ish, so I may know a little bit more than the average Joe, but like, probably not. Vampires. They either don't like sunlight, like it hurts them, or it kills them. They are creatures that feed on the blood of the living, and sometimes they end up having like supernatural powers like super strength or hypnosis capabilities. In some legends too, they turn into bats like whenever they want on a whim. I always think like they're allergic to garlic. I don't really know if it's an allergy, but they don't like garlic. I don't think it kills them, but they just can't tolerate it. Also, depending on what you're looking at, they usually sleep in a coffin. They also have no reflection when they look into a mirror. And then I think one of the newer lores that has kind of been hanging around is that they can't come into your house unless they're invited. I also know that to kill them you have to put a stake through their heart just to make sure they're done. So essentially that's all I knew before I started researching about vampires, and like damn, there is a lot of information. I would say the most universal definition of a vampire is that they are a creature of the undead and that they feed on the blood of the living to survive. That's one pretty common theme throughout multiple cultures. And normally with these legends, if you get bit by a vampire, then you will also turn into a vampire. In some instances it's slowly, in some instances it's immediately. One of the earliest instances I could find of vampire lore is in actually ancient Greece. They talk about creatures that are the living dead and that are essentially creatures that come back to life and feed on the living. These creatures though, like it's not really like they have a soul or like a thought process, like they're just kind of these, again, it's more of like a creature rather than a person. I think recently the vampire lore has turned them more into people who just happen to need to feed on blood rather than like creatures of the night. Whereas like in this ancient Greece, like it was creatures. These creatures were also very closely associated with disease, which is a common theme you will see throughout this video, is that vampires are closely associated with disease and the plague across many different cultures actually, which is interesting. So even though these creatures were mentioned as early as ancient Greece, they really didn't start picking up momentum until the medieval times during plague epidemics. Like I said, vampires and disease, like peanut butter and jelly, girl, they just go together. Unfortunately, during this time, a lot of people were just uneducated with these different types of diseases, and a lot of the diseases at the time had a lot of very physical symptoms, like bleeding lesions in your mouth, and so then your mouth is always like filled with blood and super bloody, and so obviously it kind of looks like, to the uneducated, would look like this person was feeding on blood. What the hell, right? So Researchers do point to a number of different disorders and diseases that they think helped contribute to the vampire lore and help make it, the superstition, more real and more popular during these times. One of the disorders that they point to is porphyria. So porphyria is actually a blood disorder, and what happens is when you go out into sunlight, you get all these severe blisters all over your skin, which obviously, again, to someone who's uneducated, it would look like you could not go out in sunlight. And during those times, honestly, anything and anyone that wasn't quote-unquote normal would have been looked at as a creature or different or affected in some sort. So a lot of people who had this disorder were just immediately flagged as a vampire because they can't go out in sunlight. And so people were like, During this time too, in the medieval times, it was like superstition was at an all-time high, baby. So another thing to know about this porphyria is that it can be temporarily relieved by drinking blood. If that doesn't scream vampire girl, I don't know what does. So we're gonna have a quick like Bill Nye the Science Guy. We're gonna do a quick breakdown of porphyria real quick. Nothing too scientific. Let's just do a quick skim over it. There's a bunch of different types of versions of porphyria. The specific one we are talking about affects the blood. It obstructs heme synthesis, which is what we're going to be quickly talking about. Now heme, as I flip my notes, heme is robust enough to survive through the digestive system. So when you drink blood, heme actually gets absorbed through your intestines, which is why if you drink blood, it will temporarily relieve this disorder. Nowadays, you would do regular blood transfusions to help with that, but back in, you know, the medieval times, Middle Ages, didn't have that, right? So, I mean, it is a bit curious, like, who was the first one to start drinking blood and being like, I feel so much better, you know, like, I mean, maybe that first dude was a vampire. I mean, you know, I'm just throwing it out there. If I walked into the sunlight and started blistering everywhere, my first thought wouldn't be, I should drink some blood, fuck around, see what happens. Another interesting thing about porphyria is a different version of it, so not the blood version, but a different version, actually causes excessive hair growth, which some people point to the lore of werewolves. So, honestly, this one disorder is just really out here creating legends. Like, what an icon. Now, one of the diseases that researchers point to for contributing to the vampire lore is actually rabies. And we're gonna talk about some rabies symptoms because you look at it and you're like, oh yeah, I could see how people would think that that's a creature of the night. So some common symptoms of rabies include really aggressive behavior along with biting. Could you imagine just a fully grown person biting you? I would also think that that's a vampire, so I really can't judge too much, because if a fully grown person came up to me and bit me, I'd be like, girl. Girl. The interesting thing about rabies is that also you have a strong aversion to intense smells and visual stimuli. So this is kind of where people think that the garlic came from, because garlic does have quite a strong smell, and one of the symptoms of rabies is to get like muscle spasms if you get too much of like sensory overload kind of thing. And then with the visual stimuli, that's where people think the mirrors came in, because when people saw their reflection, they would have like a reaction. So I actually think, like from what I read, they don't have a reflection. I don't think that was actually the original lore. I think it was that when they see their reflection, they freak out. So it's like after a while, it's like, oh, they can't look at their reflection. It's not that they don't have one, it's that they can't stand to look at themselves. And I think throughout the years, it's just morphed into this, oh, they don't even have a reflection. So other symptoms of rabies include insomnia. So not being able to sleep, being up all night, and then also rabies is transferred through saliva. So if someone bites you, you would get rabies as well, and then show all these, you know, unusual symptoms and characteristics. You would be acting very weird. So, I mean, I see it. I see you, rabies. Okay, I'm gonna quickly do my brows off camera just because, like, I can't talk and do my eyebrows. I will be right back. Again, during this time, it wasn't uncommon for anyone with different physical traits or mental disorders to be labeled as a vampire, because at the time, people just didn't understand like what it was or what was happening. So again, since superstition was so high here, people just assumed they were vampires or some other sort of creature of the night. You have to remember, the plague and death toll at this time was so devastating. Watch my video on the Black Plague if you want to know more. Shameless plug, that's also a great video. People were just so desperate at the time that really, I think, like, creating vampires was a way that they could make death like more tangible. Is something that they could protect themselves against or that they could blame, because at this time it was just like this invisible thing that was just killing so many people. Like, they just didn't understand really what diseases were, right? Like, they didn't have a concept of that. So there were also some other like folk tales about this, saying that babies born with teeth or babies born on Christmas Day were predetermined or destined to become vampires. So keep in mind, this is like super OG. So at this point, there was no like by the book, commonly known way to kill a vampire. So it was really like, if you died and people thought you might be a vampire or turn into one or whatever, it was a real toss-up as to what you were gonna get. You might get staked through the heart, you might have your heart pulled out and then burned to ashes, your entire body might be burned, or your head might get chopped off. It was a real, like, it could have gone any which way at this point in time. So this trickles into another suggestion on theories, I guess, on what made vampire lore so popular, and it was that people didn't understand the decomposing of bodies, like how bodies decomposed and what outside forces affected how a body decomposed. Like, they just, again, they had no idea about any of that. So like, when you think about it, if a bunch of people you know are dying with these very physical symptoms, and then you open up like Susie May's crypt and she looks young and beautiful, like, fuck me, I think she was a vampire too. I'd be like, what's going on here? Being confused about how the body decomposes kind of came in two different forms. One form was that they would find bodies that weren't decomposed at all, but now we know if they died in the winter and their body stayed cold, really cold for longer, they would decompose a lot slower than someone who's like in the middle of a swamp with a bunch of different bugs and humidity and heat, and you know what I mean? Like, they didn't know anything like that then. So they'd come across these bodies that looked essentially untouched by time, and supposedly these people had died. They were expecting them to look like a little more bony, and then they weren't. And then the other way that people were confused is when your body is decomposing, a number of things happens. One of them is that as your internal organs decompose, dark fluids start to seep out of your mouth and nose, and so if you opened a crypt and you saw that, it would look very much like that corpse had been feeding on someone, right? Because there's like blood coming from their mouth and their nose, and you'd be like, what the hell? And then what also happens is your skin shrinks, so it makes your fingernails and your hair look a lot longer, like they've been growing. So again, with like, if there was blood on your mouth and then your hair and nails look like they had been actually growing, it's not a far stretch to see why they thought vampires existed at the time. In my own research, I also came across a number of different types of vampires, and I'm sure there's way more than what I've found, but I just thought that I would share with you the types of vampires that I came across. One of them is from northern Germany, and essentially it's like a living dead creature. That's kind of the theme. Like I said, it's one of the most universal ways that humans describe vampires throughout the different cultures. Okay, I thought I'd maybe be able to pronounce it, but I won't be able to. In northern German, this is what the creature's name actually is. Whoa, here we go.
Nachzehrer.
But I'm not going to continue to butcher that, so from here on out, I'm just going to call it the living dead creature, okay? Stay with me. Interestingly enough, this creature, you can't turn into one by getting like bitten or anything like that. That's not how this lore works. It's a transformation that happens after you die, and people who normally turn into one of these creatures usually died of suicide or like an accidental, unexpected death. A rough translation of one of these after devourers, and essentially once you bury someone, what they do is they become these like chewing death creatures, and so they'll start by chewing on their death shroud. And interestingly enough, people actually think this is also because of the decomposition, not understanding it, because if blood was seeping out of your mouth, that would cause the death shroud to kind of sink into your mouth and stick to that fluid. And so if people opened up a crypt and saw that, it would look like these people had been eating their own death shroud, which I thought was interesting. It's like, it's the same issue, but a totally different take on it. These creatures, not shocking, are also associated with like plagues and diseases. So if a plague went through a town and killed a bunch of people, essentially the first person that died, people would think that they were one of these like undead creatures. From the lore that I've read, what happens is these creatures eat their own death shrouds, and then they can start eating themselves, and when they do that, that can drain the life basically out of their real family. It is said that they can also turn into pigs during the night and come and feed on their own family or close neighbors. Either or. The funny thing is the suggested remedy to stop one of these creatures is to put a big old rock in their mouth. You can put like a bunch of dirt and then a rock, and then for good measure people put a coin in there, and it's to stop their mouth from chewing and like chewing through their burial shroud and then themselves and then getting out basically. Another thing that people did to prevent these creatures from coming to life eating them is they'd actually bury them upside down. So they'd bury them facing like the dirt. So if they tried to get out, they would just kind of bury themselves deeper and deeper into the ground and wouldn't ever actually get out to feed on their family and all that. It would basically cause this creature to starve to death. If it couldn't find its way out or couldn't chew, it would starve to death and die. Then there were also Romanian vampires. Now these vampires are more closely related to, I would say, the vampires that we know today. Anyways, Romanian vampires were again undead creatures that came alive and fed on the blood of the living. But these, like, they didn't have souls. It's not like the vampires that you see today where it's like basically a human that has to drink blood. It wasn't like that. They were just basically shells of themselves. They were just literally corpses with no like conscience or real thought process. All they did was feed. Kind of like zombies. Romanian vampires. Let's look up how to pronounce that. Howtopronounce.com, honestly. Sponsor your girl, because I'm out here using you every video.
Strigoi.
Strigoi. Oh, that's easy to say. I can handle that. Okay, so Romanian vampires are called strigoi, and basically, like I said, living dead, don't have thought process, all that. In Romania, they did have quite a few suspicions on what would cause someone to turn into a vampire. It wasn't just as simple as being bitten, although that was one of the superstitions. There's actually a bunch of them, to the point where it's like, well, fuck, like, who isn't a vampire at this point, girl? Some of them included really random ones, like if you were the 7th son of a 7th son, you were basically predetermined to be a vampire and people had to watch out for you. Another one was like if you have a child outside of wedlock. When I read that, I didn't look if it was like the child is gonna be the vampire or you're the vampire after you die because you had a child outside of wedlock. I didn't look that up, I'm sorry. If you died of if you died from an unnatural death, you could be a vampire. If you were born too early, you can be a vampire. If you died before you were baptized, probably a vampire. If you had red hair and blue eyes, you're probably a vampire. I'm not even joking. That was one of the things that came up, is like people with red hair and blue eyes were probably vampires. And I'm just like, my gingers. Damn, maybe that's where the whole like soulless joke came from. Romanian vampires. Going through it, you could tell that it was just like super random things. Honestly, made no sense. But hey, I'm not judging, I'm just saying during that time, superstitions were very high because people couldn't explain anything and people were just dying. So I think, you know, through this whole plague thing, we just gotta be like, look, you guys tried your best. It just wasn't that good. A lot of the signs or symptoms that someone was a vampire complement a lot the theory that people just did not understand body decomposition. So in Romania, some of the symptoms that were used to identify you as a vampire were as follows. If the corpse swelled and turned black before being buried, if corpses were red in the face, if your body looked very freshly preserved, or this one I found was funny, if there's a small hole near your headstone, you were considered to be a vampire as well because you could get in and out, but like animals would create those holes all the time. So like, where does it end? Where do the superstitions end? I would be pretty upset if I forgot to touch on this, but along with disease and not understanding decomposition, vampire lore also got started because they buried people that weren't fucking dead. Seriously. mostly. Like people who were too drunk or were in a coma or for other reasons. There's that, is it a disease or a toxin where it's like it looks like you're dead because your pulse is so low but really you're just sleeping? I forget what that is. It's in a lot of urban myths. I forget what it is. But that, if that happens, you would also be considered dead. And they would bury people alive, which is horrifying. And I'm sure you guys have seen in so many scary movies that has showed up those little bells that are by the tombstones. That's also A, to see if you buried someone alive, and B, some people used it to determine if they were vampires. Being buried alive, you know, the bodies would shift and move, so after the person got buried alive, they'd obviously wake up, freak the fuck out. You know, there'd be scratch marks on their coffin, and their body would have been moved and in like a different position than when they were. So if someone opened it up later after that person passed away, it would look very much like a reanimated corpse because they already thought that person died when they didn't, which is super crazy. Like, oh my god, can you imagine being, I can't even, I don't even want to think about it. That is like, that makes me do that. We are gonna do a quick recap since we've been talking for a while on all the different ways that you can kill a vampire. I just want to make sure you guys are educated and can prepare yourselves for, you know, a vampire attack if that unfortunately tends to happen in your lifetime. One, you can do a stake through the heart. That's been probably the most popular method, which is interesting. I wonder why. You can also decapitate them. You can also rip out their heart and burn it to ashes. You can also burn their entire body to ashes. Holy water is supposed to repel them, but this didn't really come along until Christianity came along, so it depends how you feel on that. You can stuff their mouth filled with garlic. As you bury them, you can stuff it full of garlic to stop them from coming alive, eating you. A sacred bullet is also known to kill them. Not a silver bullet, a sacred bullet. Again, wouldn't be surprised if that came along when Christianity did as well. You can bury them face down. You can stuff a rock, a dirt, and coin in their mouths. Mouth? What? I also found this one, which I just thought was really funny. If you are being chased by a vampire, what you can do is drop a bunch of burn seeds or grains of salt, and for some reason the vampire must stop everything they're doing and count it all, so it gives you time to get away. I have no idea where that came from, but I love that. So the vampire craze really slowed down during the 18th century. Most people at this point just believed it to be like a fanciful creature, especially since poetry started coming out about vampires during this time, and this is kind of when vampires turned from gross, creepy, death-eating creatures into kind of like hot dudes. You know what I'm saying? However, in the 19th century, there was another really big vampire scare, and this took place only 2 centuries after the Salem witch trials. If you want to know more about the Salem witch trials, another shameless plug, I have done a full get ready with me video on that as well. I found that one super interesting. It's one of my favorites, along up there with Baba Yaga, but the Salem witch trials is one of the favorite videos I've ever done, so definitely go check that out. I will have that and my Black Plague in the description below, so you can just easily, quickly find it after this one. So the case we are going to be talking about is the Mercy Brown case. This happened in 1892. I believe this took place in Rhode Island. Mercy Brown was 19 years old, and she died of tuberculosis, which back in those days they called consumption. And now tuberculosis, through my research, has been associated with vampirism, but not the same way rabies and porphyria is. Those ones are like the diseases people get that make them look like vampires and act like vampires, where tuberculosis is more like it kills so many people that people blame all those deaths on a vampire. It's not quite the same, you see what I'm saying? I hope that makes sense. Like, long story short, Mercy died of consumption, tuberculosis. Her mother and her sisters were already dead, and her brother was really, really sick. You know when you got those nosy ass neighbors that just don't know how to leave well enough alone, girl? I think they were all just actually really scared. I'm making a joke of it, but like in that day it actually really wasn't a joke. Like, they were super scared, and I actually think they probably had the best intentions, but the neighbors got to talking, and they were like, I think all these deaths are due to a vampire. And from what it sounds like, it seems more like that German style of vampire, where basically a vampire comes back to life and like sucks the life out of you. It's not really like, oh, they drained their blood and they're dead. It's like they're slowly taking their life away and making them sicker and sicker, which is why vampires are so closely associated with disease, because it's something that kind of continuously starts to drain you and kill you. Anywho, neighbors started to voice concerns that they thought one of the brown women who passed away could be a vampire, just because so many people were getting sick, and yeah, again, they were just really looking for answers. Unfortunately, when they opened Mercy's grave, she looked quite good for what they were expecting, and then she also had blood in her mouth and in her heart. So obviously they chucked it up to being a vampire, which I think is not surprising to one of us, now that we've talked about it enough. Unfortunately, the neighbors took out Mercy's heart, burned it down to ashes, and then mixed it into a potion for the brother to drink, because he was still continued to get sicker and sicker. This was supposed to help him. It doesn't like say why they ever thought doing that would help him. Like, I don't know, where did that information come from? Like, who told you that you had to drink those ashes for it to make you better? Like, I don't know. Anyways, unfortunately, this didn't obviously help at all, and Edwin died a couple months later because it was actually tuberculosis, not a vampire. As I'm sure you can see, all of these are very European stories, because any American stories stemmed from Europeans coming over to North America. So depending on what kind of vampire you had, it might have been from the kind of Romanian area, or it might have been from the German area, depending if it was kind of like a shroud eater or a bloodsucker, you know? Now I'm sure you're thinking, oh, that's gotta be all on vampires. No. There's actually another major case of vampirism in the 20th century that we're going to talk about in London. However, overall, vampires did die down quite a bit in the 20th century as, you know, people started to better understand, like, decomposing bodies, and they started to kind of put in more medical, like, start to learn more about medical topics, things about the body, and sicknesses, things like that. But there is one case in 1960, which is really not that long ago, of a vampire haunting a cemetery in London. Newspapers actually covered reports of a dark, tall figure stalking the cemetery at night. He was supposed to have like glowing red eyes, and like they really like sold it, or oversold it, I guess you could say. Ow, I just poked my eye. The newspapers again also continued to embellish the story, saying that this dark figure practiced dark magic in Romania before making his way over to London. And it's just like, again, oh, I'm sorry, which one of you sat down with a vampire and talked about that? I'm gonna need some fact checking, please, ma'am. But you know, they were just there to sell newspapers, so never trust the media. Not shockingly, all of these reports ended up just being embellished stories, and really became popular for kids like legend tripping and like daring each other to go to the cemetery to see the vampire that resides there, and you know, kind of being like testing their bravery and courage. We did a lot of dumb shit like that when I was younger, so I get it. Now obviously you can't talk about vampires without at least touching on Dracula and like Nosferatu and kind of more popular pop culture, I guess, references to vampires. I'm not gonna get super into that today because I think those deserve their own story, their own spotlight, but I will say that Dracula definitely had a huge influence on how we view vampires today. As you can see, they used to be very creature based, and then for the past quite a few years now, people just think that they're like humans but need to drink blood. So yeah, the 20th century vampires very much became more of cursed humans rather than creatures of the night, which is unfortunate, but that happens. People also suggest that like vampires and vampirism was a way to kind of personify the dark side of being human, and also kind of personifying death a bit, which like I could see that. So now we're going to finish this off by talking about some modern vampires. What? Yes, there are versions of modern vampires that live among us today, and we're going to talk about them. I am just gonna go quickly finish my eyes and come back to kind of fixing my face for this last little tidbit here. Okay, so one type of modern vampire is, it's just called vampirism or Renfield's syndrome. Now this isn't like actually medically proven or anything like that. It was in I believe it was in like a psychology paper as actually like a joke, like, because Renfield is one of the characters in Dracula. Anyways, basically it's when people associate like being a vampire and sucking blood with like sexual needs kind of thing. Like there is that goes on. I'm not gonna get too much into it. Basically, people refer to it as sometimes as a personality disorder. That it's primarily found in males, and basically it's just like an erotic attraction to blood. Anyways, the next modern vampire we're going to be talking about are psychic vampires. Now, these are people who believe that they need to feed off the energy of other people, or else they feel really drained and tired. And when they do feed off of other people, those other, like their victims, are said to be, you know, tired and sleepy, just overall out of it. It's said that they drain your energy through like meditation and concentration, or they become very weak. One other thing that I forgot to add in here earlier, but like we're here now so I can't jump back, is the fact that vampires turn into bats didn't come into vampire lore until much later, when European explorers actually went to like South America and areas like that where they have the vampire bats that suck blood. So yeah, that whole vampire turning into a bat thing didn't actually come into vampire lore until like much later. That wasn't like until European explorers kind of had found like that bat and those creatures out, they had like that wasn't part of the vampire lore or legend, which is why I haven't been mentioning it throughout the video. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I hope you learned a lot about vampires. Definitely check out my Salem Witch Trials and Black Plague videos. They will be linked down below. Definitely check out my Instagram. I do a lot of like witchy sort of topics on there. You can find like spreads and my short videos I've done on there. I do sometimes pixie hair tutorials all over there. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel so you don't lose me in the social media void, and I'll see you guys in my next video.